Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, the city outside was already glowing with winter light. Inside a small Manhattan apartment, 21-year-old Katherine Woods leaned toward the bathroom mirror, steadying her hand as she traced a thin line of black along her eyelid. The fluorescent light above the sink hummed softly. Somewhere down on the street, a car horn blared and then faded. Her phone buzzed on the counter beside her. She didn't look at it. Whoever it was could wait. She had a 7 p.m. shift, and in New York City, being late was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 years earlier, Katherine had left Ohio with a suitcase, a pair of worn ballet slippers, and a dream that felt too big for her hometown. She wanted Broadway. She wanted the stage lights and the orchestra swell and the moment when the curtain rose and the world went silent just for her. New York, however, had its own script. Rent devoured her savings. Classes cost more than she expected. Every audition seemed to end with the same polite smile and the same promise, "We'll be in touch." So Katherine worked. She waited tables. She taught children how to plie and spin without wobbling. And at night, on nights like this, she stepped into a different version of herself. A version she never talked about. Near Times Square, beneath neon and noise, stood a strip club called Flash Dancers. That was where she was headed. Where she would smile under harsh lights and pretend she wasn't counting the minutes. She hated it, but it paid for voice lessons. It paid for dance classes. It paid for Manhattan. And Manhattan mattered, because when she had first arrived in New York, she had chosen a cheaper neighborhood. A cheaper apartment, a cheaper landlord. That mistake had nearly broken her. The assault had been sudden, violent, and shattering. For weeks afterward, she had considered packing up and going home, back to Ohio, back to safety, back to small town streets where nothing glittered but everything felt familiar. But Katherine was stubborn. She refused to let one man steal her dream. So she moved, found a safer building in Manhattan, took on more shifts, found a roommate to split the rent. David Hahn, 23, from Ohio, familiar, reliable, at least, that's what she told herself. Right now, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone to get his car so he could drive her to work. It was a small gesture, but in a city that never slowed down, it felt like someone had pressed pause just for her. Katherine stepped out of the bathroom and into the living room. A black dog lay stretched across the floor, asleep, its chest rising and falling slowly. The dog wasn't hers. It wasn't David's either. David picked up extra money dog-sitting when he could, and this one was just passing through, like so many people in New York. Katherine carefully stepped over it. She and David had once been something more than roommates. For a while, they had tried being a couple. It hadn't lasted. Life in New York was too tight, too expensive, too unforgiving for fragile relationships. Now they shared rent, shared space, shared silence. But sometimes, especially after Thanksgiving dinners eaten together in that small apartment, she wondered if maybe they had given up too easily. A few days earlier, instead of flying home to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in the city. Just the two of them. Cheap wine, takeout, a movie neither of them really watched. It had been simple, comfortable, and for a moment, it had almost felt like home. Katherine walked toward her bedroom to finish getting dressed for work. Behind her, the dog suddenly stirred. Then it began to bark. David had always known about Flash Dancers. He had known from the beginning. And unlike so many others, he had never looked at Katherine differently because of it. He hadn't flinched, hadn't lectured, hadn't offered the thin, brittle kind of pity people mistake for kindness. He simply accepted it. And in a city that judged everything, your shoes, your accent, your rent, your worth, that acceptance felt rare. It felt safe. But safety came with a complication. If there was one thing David could not seem to tolerate, it was the men in Katherine's orbit. It didn't matter who they were. He distrusted them on sight. Some of it, Katherine understood. There had been Joe, the club regular who blurred the line between customer and suitor. Even she could admit Joe carried himself with the oily confidence of someone who believed money could purchase intimacy. But then there was Paul. Paul, the personal trainer at her gym. Polite, fit, mild-mannered, the kind of man who asked David about his day and actually waited for the answer. Katherine and Paul weren't even dating anymore. They spoke occasionally. Short phone calls, casual updates. Yet David insisted Paul was a creep. He's not right, David had said once, jaw tight. Based on what? Katherine had asked. I just know. That was the problem. David always just knew. And maybe that was the real hurdle. The quiet, simmering jealousy neither of them named. The unspoken history between them that never quite dissolved. Still, tonight was not the night to untangle romance. Tonight was about eyeliner, heels, and getting downstairs on time. I'll figure it out later, she muttered to herself as she stepped into her bedroom to change. That's when the dog started barking. Not a lazy, half-asleep woof. A sharp, alert bark. Once, twice, then continuous. Katherine paused, one shoe in hand. Hey, she called softly, stepping back toward the living room. The barking didn't stop. A few minutes later, outside on the sidewalk, David hurried toward his car. The November air was biting, sharp against his lungs. He jogged the last stretch, breath clouding in front of him. He was late. He hated being late. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and pulled back toward the apartment building. As he stopped out front, he called Katherine. No answer. He frowned. Maybe she was still finishing up. He switched on his hazard lights and stepped out, taking the stairs two at a time. By the time he reached the second floor, his breathing was heavy again. He turned down the hallway toward apartment 2D, and froze. The black dog stood in the hallway. Alone. No, not alone. A leash was clipped to its collar. And at the other end of that leash stood Brad Stewart. Brad, the neighbor David barely knew. The man who nodded stiffly in passing and never made conversation. For a split second, both men stared at each other. Brad looked startled. David looked confused. I found him wandering, Brad said quickly, gesturing to the dog. Recognized him. Figured. He was yours. Quote. David blinked. He was inside. Quote. Brad shrugged. Well, he wasn't when I saw him. I knocked. No one answered. Quote. Something tightened in David's chest. He took the leash slowly. Thanks. Quote. Brad lingered a moment too long before stepping back toward his own door. David turned to 2D. The door was closed. He twisted the handle. Unlocked. He couldn't remember leaving it that way. Katherine, he called as he stepped inside. Silence. The apartment felt wrong. Not messy. Not overturned. Just wrong. The kind of stillness that hums in your ears. Her bedroom door was slightly ajar. Katherine, he called again, moving toward it. Nothing. He reached the door and pushed gently. It moved a few inches. Then stopped. Resistance. Like something heavy pressed against it from the other side. His pulse kicked hard. Adrenaline flooded his arms, his throat, his vision narrowing to a single point. Katherine, he shouted, shoving the door with force. This time it gave. He leaned in, and whatever he saw inside made him recoil instantly. He stumbled backward as if burned, his face draining of color. He turned, ran, burst into the hallway, hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. And dialed the police. Around 7:30 p.m., just 30 minutes after the frantic 911 call, and New York City Police Department detective named Stephen Getz climbed the narrow staircase of a Manhattan apartment building. This neighborhood was known for quiet evenings and doormen who recognized every resident by name. Violent crime was rare here. Homicide was almost unheard of. But if the caller had told the truth, apartment 2D held something brutal. When Getz reached the second-floor landing, red and blue lights flickered faintly through the stairwell window. A few uniformed officers were already in the hallway. One of them was speaking to a thin young man who looked pale and shaken. The man clutched a leash, and at the other end stood a black dog, restless and whining softly. An officer stepped toward Getz. That's David Hahn, he said quietly. Roommate. He found the body, called it in. Quote. And the victim, Katherine Woods, she's in the back bedroom. Quote. Getz gave a short nod. Before asking questions, he wanted to see it for himself. He moved down the hallway, passing David without a word. David's face was blotchy, his breathing uneven. The dog tugged lightly against the leash, as if confused by the tension in the air. At the apartment door, Getz slipped on a pair of disposable gloves. He examined the frame, the lock, the handle. No splintered wood, no pry marks, no visible damage. If someone had entered by force, they had left no obvious sign. He stepped inside. The living room was small. A futon sat pulled out. A few items of men's clothing were scattered across the floor. It looked lived in, messy, but not chaotic. Not ransacked. Nothing immediately screamed violence. Getz walked carefully, eyes scanning every surface, committing details to memory without touching more than necessary. Then he approached the bedroom. The door was open only partially. Just enough space for him to turn sideways and step through. The smell hit him first. Metallic, thick, blood. When he entered fully, the scene unfolded in a way that even seasoned detectives never truly grow used to. Blood was everywhere. It painted the walls in dark arcs. It soaked into furniture. It stained the floor in deep, spreading pools. The room looked as if it had exploded from the inside. A dresser drawer hung open, its contents, women's clothing, scattered across the floor. The mattress had been ripped from the bed frame and lay crumpled on the ground. That was what had blocked the door from opening all the way. And in the center of it all, Katherine Woods. She lay on her back in a pool of blood. Getz crouched beside her. She wore a t-shirt and underwear. The shirt bore a distinct shoe print across the chest, clear enough to be seen without equipment. Someone had stepped on her. More than that, she had been stabbed, at least a dozen times. The wounds marked her torso, her arms, her body in frantic repetition. On her hands and forearms were defensive wounds, cuts and slashes that told a story without words. She had fought. She had tried to protect herself. But the worst damage was to her neck. Her throat had been slashed so deeply it nearly separated her head from her body. Getz exhaled slowly through his nose. This was not controlled. This was not calculated. This was rage. Footsteps approached from behind him. He stood and turned as the forensic team from the New York City Police Department entered the room, maneuvering carefully around the narrow doorway. The mattress blocking the door made movement difficult. One of the technicians lifted it slowly, propping it against the wall so the door could swing fully open. Getz stepped back, giving them space. He watched as they photographed every inch of the room. They carefully removed the shoe print from Katherine's t-shirt. Then they located a second, identical print pressed into the bed sheets. 2 impressions, same tread, same size. To the naked eye, the prints appeared to belong to an average-sized adult male. Whoever had stood over Katherine Woods, whoever had stepped on her, had likely been a man, and he had stood there long enough to leave his mark. Detective Getz stepped back into the living room, his mind already racing through the scene he had just observed. A few pairs of men's shoes lay scattered near the entrance. Unremarkable at first glance, the treads didn't match the prints on Katherine Woods' body. But the sizes were identical, another puzzle piece that refused to fall into place. An hour later, at approximately 8:30 p.m., Getz sat across from David Hahn in a stark interview room at the NYPD's 19th precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table. The young man's hands trembled slightly, a small but telling signal. David was Katherine's roommate, and at this point, the prime person of interest. No signs of forced entry suggested the killer either had access to the apartment or was let in willingly. The savage nature of the knife wounds, the defensiveness of Katherine's injuries, and the absence of theft all pointed toward a personal motive. And David fit that profile perfectly. Same shoe size, same access, same last to see her alive connection. Getz eyes flicked to David's forearms and hands. No scratches, no bruises, no traces of a struggle. Odd. Katherine had clearly fought for her life. She would have left marks. But Getz held his observation back, leaning in with a sympathetic tone, letting the young man relax while he painted the bigger picture of what he needed to hear. "Walk me through the day," he said. David inhaled deeply. His voice quavered, but he began. He had been at the apartment until 6:40 p.m., retrieving his car to drive Katherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. The Trip had taken longer than expected because he stopped to chat with coworkers at his doorman job. By the time he returned, Katherine wasn't outside. He called. No answer. Confused, he went inside and found his neighbor Brad holding the leash of the black dog. David had been dog-sitting. Then, upon entering the apartment, he discovered Katherine's body and called 911 immediately, around 7 p.m. Getz froze for a moment. 20 minutes. That was all the killer supposedly needed to commit an extremely violent murder and disappear. The time frame was staggering, implausible, yet David's distress seemed genuine. Keeping his tone calm, Getz asked how long David had known Katherine. "We met in Ohio," David admitted, recounting how he had moved to New York to live with her after they dated. They had broken up, and he had been forced to sleep in his car until Katherine relented, letting him move back on the futon in the living room. Every detail, Getz noted. Every hesitation, every word. David was more than just a roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend, the last person to see her alive, the one who discovered her body. As David paused, Getz scribbled furiously in his notepad, weighing every clue. Then he asked casually, "What's your shoe size?" 10.5, David answered without hesitation. Getz jotted it down, standing to leave. But David's story wasn't over. The detective's mind churned. He had to confirm details with forensics, cross-check with neighbors, and see if David's account held under scrutiny. The night stretched on, coffee fueling his relentless interrogation. For nearly 19 hours, Getz would push, probe, and watch, every glance and gesture a potential key to the truth, and every second bringing him closer to exposing what the young man might be hiding. Detective Getz was running on fumes, caffeine coursing through him as he went over the reports from uniformed officers and neighbors. Each note contradicted pieces of David Hahn's story. David had claimed he left the apartment at 6:40 p.m., Katherine fine and waiting. But witness statements told another story. The neighbor directly above had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. Another neighbor next door reported hearing screams, barking, and furniture being moved between 5:45 and 6 o'clock p.m. Brad Stewart, the man who had found the black dog, placed David in the hallway sometime between 6 o'clock and 6:30 p.m., a full half-hour before David claimed he discovered Katherine's body. Getz knew time estimates in a dense New York City apartment could be unreliable, but the discrepancies were too wide to ignore. David's alibi was fraying. He took another swig of coffee, then his phone buzzed. The forensics team had updates on the shoe prints. Both the print on Katherine's shirt and the one on the bed sheets matched. A men's size 10.5, exactly David's size. With this confirmation, Getz returned to the interrogation room. This time he offered no water, no small talk. He leaned in, placing the facts squarely on the table. The killer's shoe prints are your size. Neighbors heard screams before you said you left. Brad saw you in the hallway earlier than your account. Security cameras are being accessed now. You need to tell the truth. Quote. David's face drained of color. Exhaustion gave way to fear. For the first time, he realized Getz didn't believe him. "I didn't do it," he said, voice shaking. "Please believe me." Quote. Getz remained impassive, his stare unwavering. Desperate, David launched into a story he had kept quiet. Katherine had known a man named Paul Cortez. She had dated him briefly, but David thought Paul was a creep. According to David, Katherine had said Paul was obsessed with her. "You need to investigate him, not me," David insisted. Getz recorded the lead. He had to follow every avenue, no matter how desperate the deflection. By the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, the NY press gathering outside. The next morning, the city awoke to a headline that made Getz grimace: "Secret Life of Slain Stripper," the front page of the New York Daily News. Katherine's family had flown in from Ohio, shocked to discover her work at Flash Dancers. The media frenzy threatened to overwhelm the investigation. Getz knew tips would flood in, complicating the case. He set the paper down and moved back to the interrogation room. David's exculpatory claim had led to the man officers had tracked down, Paul Cortez. As Getz entered the room, he immediately noted Paul's shoes, a typical size. Another potential suspect, but nothing yet linking him to the crime. Getz' focus remained sharp. He had pieced together the timeline, the evidence, and now had a suspect whose alibi and behavior could be tested. The investigation was far from over, but the walls were closing in on the man who had been the last to see Katherine Woods alive. Detective Getz studied Paul Cortez carefully, noting at a glance that his shoes, too, could be a 10.5, matching the killer prints found at Katherine's apartment. He also examined Paul's hands and forearms for injuries, and saw a small scrape on one fingertip. When asked, Paul explained it was from getting pinched between weights at the gym. He spoke softly and calmly, portraying himself as cooperative, emphasizing that he had followed all the media coverage of Katherine's murder and wanted to help. Paul explained that David Hahn, Katherine's roommate and ex-boyfriend, had always been jealous of his relationship with her. He recounted meeting Katherine at the gym about a year prior, and how they had been dating intermittently. At the time of her death, they were not together, though Paul still cared for her and had hoped for reconciliation. Paul claimed he had not seen Katherine on the day of her death, though they had spoken briefly on the phone that afternoon, a normal pattern for them. He had tried calling her again later that day, but she didn't answer. That evening, Paul said, he went out shopping with friends and then to a bar to watch the Jets game around 8:30 p.m. Getz made a note to verify this alibi. When pressed about potential threats, Paul mentioned a man named Joe, a former patron of Katherine's from Flash Dancers who had somehow acquired her phone number months prior. Paul suspected Joe was responsible for an earlier incident in which Katherine had been roofied during a shift at the club. Despite no concrete proof, Paul had always believed Joe had administered the date rape drug, which had left Katherine incapacitated. Paul said he had urged Katherine to quit exotic dancing, but she refused, and he even tried contacting her father to express concern, an action that angered Katherine and caused a brief rift between them. Getz noted all of this carefully, asking if Paul had a way to contact Joe. Paul didn't have the number but said it was stored in Katherine's phone. The last time he spoke with her, she had mentioned Joe had started calling again after months of silence, a development that caught Paul by surprise. Detective Getz studied Paul's face closely for any signs of deception. While the Joe story could have been a diversion, Paul's manner and tone seemed credible. Plus, the phone records would be easy to verify. Despite his gut instincts, Getz reluctantly admitted that perhaps the press wasn't wrong. He might need to consider the possibility that one of Katherine's club patrons, not Paul, had played a role in her murder. The following afternoon, November 30th, Getz felt a twinge of frustration as he hung up the phone after a reporter's inquiry. No arrest had been made yet, and the media buzz was intensifying. Turning back to his desk, he focused on the stack of Katherine's subpoenaed phone records. As he reviewed them, it confirmed Paul's story. Both he and Joe had called Katherine shortly before her death. The investigation was widening. While Paul appeared truthful, the potential involvement of someone like Joe meant Getz would now need to follow a new trail, looking carefully at Katherine's interactions with her patrons and the dangerous shadows that lurked in the world she inhabited. Every call, every timestamp, every detail mattered now. This case was far from closed. Detective Getz had called in Joe for questioning, hoping to get clarity about the mysterious call he had made to Katherine just before her death. Getz asked Joe why, after months of silence, he had reached out. Joe claimed it was innocent. He just wanted to check in and wish her a happy Thanksgiving. But when Getz pressed further, asking point-blank whether he had ever roofied anyone's drink, Joe's eyes widened, and his response was shaky and defensive. The detective couldn't help but feel that Joe was lying, and a gnawing doubt crept in. The investigation was suddenly much wider than he had imagined. A few days ago, Getz had been certain David Hahn was the killer. But with new people from Katherine's life emerging, Paul, Joe, and others, his original suspect was starting to look More innocent. David's co-workers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman confirmed that he had stopped to chat with them the evening of Katherine's death, just as he claimed. Even the security footage from the apartment building lined up perfectly. David was captured leaving the front entrance at 6:38 p.m., almost exactly when he said he left. This didn't necessarily prove David was innocent, because neighbors had reported hearing screams before 6:38, and the hallway outside apartment 2D wasn't covered by any cameras. There was still a possibility that someone else, Brad Stewart or another person, had entered the apartment while David was gone. Just as Getz was processing this, his phone rang. It was a forensics team member, and the excitement in their voice was palpable. They had discovered something significant that had been missed during the first sweep of Katherine's apartment. The mattress T-hat had been propped against the wall behind her bedroom door. The same mattress that had been blocking entry had actually been concealing a critical piece of evidence, a bloody handprint on the wall. Only after days of meticulous searching did the team realize it had been there all along. Getz' mind raced. If he could obtain handprints from his suspects, he could match them to the one on the wall, a breakthrough that could solve the case. But there was a catch. Some of his suspects had already lawyered up, refusing to cooperate with police or provide prints unless they were arrested first. Getz found himself in a frustrating deadlock. He needed the prints to make an arrest, but couldn't make an arrest without the prints. Weeks passed, and the investigation stalled. Detective Getz was left staring at files and reports, growing increasingly frustrated. Every lead seemed to circle back to dead ends. Every suspect had a story, and legal restrictions hampered every move he tried to make. What had started as a seemingly straightforward investigation into a brutal murder had turned into a tangled web of suspicion, timing discrepancies, and elusive evidence. Katherine's death remained unsolved, and with each passing day, the pressure on Getz and the city's sense of justice only intensified. 3 weeks after Katherine's brutal murder, on December 16, 2005, a tip from a woman who had seen the front page of a New York newspaper finally cracked the case wide open. The forensic evidence and witness accounts allowed police to reconstruct exactly what had happened that evening. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., Katherine's killer quietly climbed the stairs of her Manhattan apartment building, knowing she was preparing for her shift at Flash Dancers. Consumed with jealousy over Katherine's work and attention to other men, the killer was past reasoning. The apartment door was unlocked. They slipped inside, knife in hand. The black dog startled the intruder, giving Katherine just enough time to see the knife. She screamed and bolted into her bedroom, attempting to barricade herself with the mattress. But the killer forced their way in. A brutal struggle ensued. Furniture toppled, the room descended into chaos, and the killer, blinded by rage, stabbed Katherine repeatedly, eventually leaving her lifeless body on the floor. In the process, the killer left a bloody handprint on the wall, a detail that would later become the key to solving the case. After fleeing out the back, avoiding all security cameras, the killer disappeared into the city. Weeks later, a young woman recognized the killer's face on a newspaper cover. She recalled that he had assaulted her a year prior and immediately called the NYPD. Her tip led detectives to Paul Cortez. Forensics confirmed his handprint matched the one on Katherine's wall, and cell tower data placed him near her apartment during the murder. Paul's meticulous timing had allowed him to act while David, Katherine's roommate and on-again, off-again boyfriend, was away for just 20 minutes. On December 23, 2005, Paul Cortez was arrested, tried, and found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, bringing justice to Katherine Woods and ending the nightmare that had gripped her friends, family, and the city.